On a crisp autumn evening in a mid-sized American city, the police chief was finally heading home after what had been an exhausting day at headquarters. The streetlights cast long shadows across the road as he drove his dark blue Lincoln Navigator through the winding streets of Pine Ridge, one of the city's more affluent neighborhoods. The clock on his dashboard read 8:45 p.m. As the first black police chief in the city's history, he had spent the past 3 years working tirelessly to rebuild trust between law enforcement and the community. Today had been particularly demanding, with back-to-back meetings about implementing new community policing initiatives and reviewing department policies. He was looking forward to getting home, having dinner with his family, and maybe catching the end of the basketball game. The chief was dressed in civilian clothes, a navy blazer and khakis, having changed out of his uniform before leaving the office. He preferred driving his personal vehicle when not on official duty, believing it helped him stay connected to the everyday experiences of the citizens he served. The Navigator had been a reward to himself after 25 years in law enforcement, starting as a beat cop and working his way up through the ranks. As he turned onto Maple Avenue, he noticed a patrol car in his rearview mirror. At first, he thought nothing of it. Officers regularly patrolled this area. But after 3 consecutive turns, it became clear the patrol car was following him. The chief maintained his speed exactly at the limit, made complete stops at every sign, and used his turn signals properly, habits ingrained from decades of police work. His mind wandered to the community meeting he had attended last week, where residents had raised concerns about racial profiling in traffic stops. He had promised to address these issues, implementing new training programs and accountability measures. The irony of his current situation wasn't lost on him. The patrol car's lights suddenly flashed to life, painting the interior of his SUV in alternating red and blue. The chief let out a long breath, carefully signaling and pulling over to the curb. He turned down the soft jazz playing on his radio and placed both hands on the steering wheel, visible through the windshield. Through his side mirror, he watched the officer approach, noting the unnecessarily tense posture and hand positioned near the holster, telltale signs of preconceived notions about the driver. In all his years of service, the chief had seen this scenario play out countless times from both sides of the badge. But tonight, he was about to experience it firsthand. The chief thought about his teenage son, who had recently gotten his driver's license. Just last week, they had the talk, not about birds and bees, but about how to behave during a traffic stop. "Keep your hands visible, move slowly, speak respectfully," he had told his son. Now here he was, following his own advice. In the growing darkness, the chief could see neighbors peeking through their curtains at the scene unfolding on their quiet street. Some had their phones out, recording, a sign of the times and a reflection of the public's complicated relationship with law enforcement. He knew that what happened next would matter not just for him personally, but for the larger conversation about policing in their community. As the officer's footsteps grew closer, the chief remained calm, drawing on years of experience in high-pressure situations. He had worked hard to create a department that served all citizens equally and fairly. What was about to unfold would put those efforts to the test in a way he never expected. The tap on his window was harder than necessary, and as he pressed the button to lower it, the chief prepared himself for an interaction that would likely become a defining moment in his department's history. The cool night air carried the scent of autumn leaves into his car, along with the unmistakable tension of what was about to become much more than a routine traffic stop. "Would you like me to continue with part 2 of the story?" "License and registration," came the sharp command through the window, the officer's tone carrying an edge that seemed unnecessary for a routine traffic stop. The beam from his flashlight swept aggressively across the car's interior, lingering a bit too long on the chief's face. The chief responded with the measured calm he developed over his 25 years in law enforcement. "Good evening, officer," he said, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" "I said license and registration," the officer repeated, his voice rising slightly. The beam of the flashlight remained fixed on the chief's face, despite department training that specifically advised against this intimidation tactic. "I understand, and I'll comply," the chief replied evenly. "But I have the right to know the reason for this stop." He noticed the officer's nameplate in the flashlight's reflection, a 7-year veteran of the force. The chief recognized him from department meetings, though they'd never directly interacted. The tension in the air thickened as the officer shifted his weight, his hand still hovering near his weapon. "You were driving suspiciously through this neighborhood. Made a lot of turns. This is a high-end area, and we've had reports of suspicious vehicles." The chief absorbed these words, each one a perfect example of the very profiling issues he'd been working to eliminate from his department. The supposed suspicious driving was nothing more than a black man in an expensive car making perfectly legal turns in a predominantly white neighborhood. "I'm going to reach for my credentials now," the chief announced clearly, moving his right hand slowly toward his jacket pocket. The movement caused the officer to take a step back, his hand now firmly on his holster. The chief couldn't help but think about how this same scenario had ended tragically for too many others. From his pocket, he first produced his driver's license, holding it up to the window. Then, with the same deliberate movements, he reached for the glove compartment. "I'm now getting my registration and insurance," he narrated, following the very protocol he helped develop for the department. The officer snatched the license with unnecessary force, shining his light on it. The chief watched in the side mirror as the officer's expression shifted from stern authority to shocked recognition. The transformation would have been almost comical if the situation weren't so serious. Chief," the officer stammered, the flashlight beam dropping to the ground. I didn't." "Yes," the chief replied calmly, "though that shouldn't matter, should it? Every citizen deserves to be treated with respect during a traffic stop, wouldn't you agree?" The officer's posture deflated, his hand finally dropping from his weapon. Several neighbors had gathered on their porches now, phones recording the interaction. The chief knew this moment would likely be all over social media by morning, but he was more concerned about using it as a teaching opportunity. "Sir, I apologize, I didn't recognize." The officer began, but the chief raised his hand gently. "Let's continue this stop properly," the chief interrupted. "You still haven't clearly stated the traffic violation that prompted this stop. Could you please explain the specific infraction?" The officer shifted uncomfortably, aware that his earlier explanation of suspicious driving wouldn't hold up under any scrutiny. The dashcam was recording every word, and they both knew it. "I observed." The officer started, then stopped, realizing he had no legitimate reason to articulate. The chief could see the younger officer's face reddening even in the dim street lighting. "I'll tell you what," the chief said, maintaining his professional demeanor. "I'd like you to call your supervisor to the scene. This is a teachable moment for our entire department." As the officer stepped back to his patrol car to make the call, the chief remained in his vehicle, documenting every detail of the interaction in his phone's notes app. He thought about how many similar stops happened every day across the country, involving citizens who didn't have the protection of a badge and title. Within minutes, 2 more patrol cars arrived, their lights cutting through the darkness. The watch commander, recognizing the chief's vehicle, approached quickly. The growing crowd of neighbors had doubled, and the chief knew this incident would force a long overdue conversation within the department. The watch commander's face showed genuine concern as he approached the chief's window. "Sir, I can't begin to apologize." "No apologies needed right now," the chief interrupted quietly. "But tomorrow morning, I want every piece of footage from this stop, dashcam, bodycam, everything, on my desk. We're going to use this, not to punish, but to learn, to do better." The neighbors were still watching, still recording. The chief could hear snippets of their whispered conversations, could feel the weight of this moment. What had started as a biased traffic stop was about to become a catalyst for real change in the department. As he was finally cleared to leave, the chief watched in his rearview mirror as the 3 officers huddled in discussion. He knew tomorrow would be challenging, but necessary. Sometimes the best lessons came from the most uncomfortable moments, and he was determined to make this one count. The next morning, the chief arrived at headquarters earlier than usual. The events of the previous night had left him with much to consider, and sleep had been elusive. As he walked through the building's main entrance, he noticed the supple shift in how officers and staff regarded him, a mix of concern, curiosity, and something that looked like shame. The video had already made its rounds on social media. His phone had been buzzing since dawn with messages from community leaders, local politicians, and reporters all wanting statements about the incident. But the chief had bigger plans than just making statements. He wanted to create real change. In his office, he found the requested footage already waiting on his desk. The watch commander had made sure it was delivered first thing, complete with all radio communications from before and during the stop. The chief settled into his chair, took a deep breath, and pressed play. The dashcam footage told an even more troubling story than he'd experienced firsthand. The radio chatter before the stop revealed the officer's prejudiced assumptions. Got a black male in a high-end SUV circling the area. Doesn't look like he belongs here. Gonna check it out. The chief shook his head, hearing the echoes of outdated police culture in every word. As he watched the footage, his assistant knocked on the door. "Sir, the officer from last night is waiting outside. He's been here since before I arrived." The chief wasn't surprised. He'd seen the mix of fear and remorse in the young officer's eyes the night before. "Send him in," he said, pausing the video. The officer who entered his office was a different person from the aggressive figure of the previous night. His shoulders were slumped, his face drawn with worry. He stood at attention, likely expecting to be fired on the spot. "Sit down," the chief said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "I've been reviewing the footage." He turned his computer monitor so they could both see it. "I'd like you to watch it with me and tell me what you see." For the next 20 minutes, they watched in silence. The officer winced at his own voice, his aggressive stance, the unnecessary intimidation tactics. When it was finished, he looked at the chief with genuine regret in his eyes. "Sir, I'm prepared to turn in my badge," he said quietly. The chief leaned back in his chair, studying the younger man. "That's the easy way out," he replied. "And it doesn't solve the bigger problem. Tell me, what made you follow my vehicle last night?" The officer shifted uncomfortably. I saw an expensive car in that neighborhood, and the driver was black," the chief finished for him. "Let's not dance around it. You saw a black man driving an expensive car in a white neighborhood, and you immediately assumed something was wrong. The question is, why?" What followed was an hour-long conversation about implicit bias, about growing up in a society that subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, reinforces racial stereotypes. The officer spoke about his upbringing in a small, predominantly white town, his limited interactions with people of different backgrounds, and the assumptions he carried into his police work without even realizing it. The chief listened, taking mental notes. This wasn't just about one officer or one traffic stop. It was about patterns of behavior that needed to be addressed throughout the entire department. "Here's what's going to happen," the chief finally said. "You're not fired, but you're going to help me make some changes." He outlined his plan. The officer would be temporarily reassigned to community outreach, working directly with neighborhood groups he previously viewed with suspicion. As they talked, the chief's phone kept buzzing with messages. Local news outlets had picked up the story, and there were calls for the officer's immediate termination. But the chief had seen something in their conversation, a genuine desire to learn and change, that he believed could be more valuable than punishment. "The easy thing would be to fire you and make a public statement about zero tolerance," the chief explained. "But that doesn't create real change. It just pushes the problem somewhere else. Instead, you're going to help me show other officers what real transformation looks like." The chief pulled up the department's training materials on his computer. "See this?" he said, pointing to the standard diversity training modules. "This isn't enough. We need something real, something based on actual experiences, your experience. Last night's footage is going to become part of our new training program, and you're going to help develop it." As they discussed the details, the chief could see the younger officer beginning to understand the magnitude of what they were undertaking. This wasn't just about saving his job, it was about contributing to meaningful change in police culture. By the time the officer left his office, the chief had already started drafting a department-wide memo. The incident would become a cornerstone of new training initiatives, but first, they needed to address the immediate aftermath. Community leaders would need to be brought into the conversation, and transparency would be crucial. Looking out his office window at the city he'd sworn to protect and serve, the chief realized that sometimes the most powerful changes come from the most uncomfortable moments. Last night's traffic stop could have ended very differently. Instead, it was becoming a catalyst for transformation. The investigation into the traffic stop revealed far more than anyone had expected. As the chief sat in the conference room surrounded by stacks of reports, data analysis, and citizen complaints, a troubling pattern began to emerge. His personal experience had opened a door to a much bigger problem within the department. The numbers were impossible to ignore. The data analyst he'd assigned to review traffic stop statistics had found that minority drivers were being pulled over at rates far higher than their representation in the population. But it wasn't just about numbers, it was about people, about trust broken and fears confirmed. "Look at this," the analyst said, pointing to a chart on her laptop. In the past year alone, discretionary stops, ones where there wasn't a clear traffic violation, show an even bigger disparity. She scrolled through spreadsheet after spreadsheet, each telling the same story in different ways. The chief remembered his own words to his teenage son. "It's not about if you get pulled over, it's about when." He'd said it matter-of-factly, as if accepting this reality was just part of life. Now, sitting in this room filled with evidence of systemic bias, those words felt heavier than ever. The investigation had started with one officer's traffic stops but quickly expanded. They found previously dismissed complaints buried in old files, each one a missed opportunity for correction and growth. Body camera footage revealed patterns of behavior that should have raised red flags long ago. "Sir," his assistant interrupted, poking her head into the conference room. "The Community Advisory Board is here for their meeting." The chief looked at his watch. He'd been reviewing files for hours without realizing it. This meeting wasn't originally planned to discuss the traffic stop incident, but he knew it would be the main topic. As he gathered his materials, he decided to bring the raw data with him. The community deserved to see exactly what they'd found. The advisory board meeting room was packed. Community leaders, concerned citizens, and even a few off-duty officers filled every chair. The tension in the room was palpable, but there was something else too, a sense of possibility of potential change. "I'm not here to make excuses," the chief began, standing at the podium. "I'm here to share what we found, and more importantly, to listen to your experiences." He gestured to the screen behind him, where the analyst began displaying the data they'd uncovered. For the next 3 hours, the meeting became something more than just a presentation of statistics. People began sharing their stories, parents talking about teaching their children how to safely interact with police, elderly residents describing decades of unnecessary stops, young professionals detailing the emotional toll of constant suspicion. The officer from the traffic stop was there too, sitting quietly in the back. The chief had asked him to attend, not to speak, but to listen. Throughout the meeting, the chief watched as the officer's expression shifted from defensive to understanding, especially when a teenager described an almost identical stop he'd experienced just weeks earlier. "This isn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame," the chief said as the meeting drew to a close. "It's about acknowledging reality so we can change it. My own experience showed me that even as chief, I wasn't immune. But it also showed me that we have an opportunity here." He outlined the initial steps they'd be taking: a complete overhaul of traffic stop protocols, mandatory review of stop data for patterns of bias, and a new training program developed with community input. But the most important change would be in how complaints were handled. "No more buried reports," he promised. "No more dismissed experiences. We're setting up an independent review board with real power to investigate and recommend action." After the meeting, as people lingered to talk in small groups, the chief noticed the officer from his traffic stop deep in conversation with some of the community members who had shared their stories. There were no raised voices, no pointed fingers, just people talking, listening, trying to understand each other's perspectives. One of the elder community leaders approached the chief. "You know," she said quietly, "I've been coming to these meetings for 30 years. This is the first time I felt like we were really being heard." The chief nodded, watching as more officers who had attended the meeting joined the conversations around the room. This was how change started, not with grand announcements or sweeping reforms, but with people willing to listen and learn from each other. As he gathered his materials to leave, he found the data analyst still working at her laptop. "There's more," she said, looking up. "I've started looking into arrest records, use of force reports, everything. The traffic stops are just the beginning." The chief pulled up a chair. "Show me," he said. As they dived back into the data, he knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, more difficult conversations, and probably some resistance to change. But for the first time, he felt like they were finally asking the right questions and looking for real answers. 2 weeks after the traffic stop incident, the changes in the police department were already visible. The chief stood in the training room, watching as officers filed in for what they probably expected to be another routine diversity training session. Instead, they found their fellow officer, the one from the traffic stop, standing at the front of the room. "I'm going to show you something," the officer began, his voice slightly shaky but determined. "It's not easy to watch, especially since I'm the one in the video. But it's important." He pressed play, and the dashcam footage from that night filled the screen. The room fell silent as they watched the encounter unfold. Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, perhaps recognizing their own behaviors in the footage. Others took notes, their expressions thoughtful and concerned. When the video ended, the officer didn't immediately speak. He took a deep breath, looking around at his colleagues. "That night," he said finally, "I thought I was just doing my job. But I was wrong. I was profiling, plain and simple. And if I hadn't pulled over our chief, I might never have realized it." The training session that followed wasn't like anything the department had seen before. Instead of PowerPoint slides about policies and procedures, it was raw, honest conversation. The officer shared his journey of the past 2 weeks, the community meetings he'd attended, the stories he'd heard, the assumptions he'd been forced to confront. "I used to think I was one of the good ones," he admitted to the room. "But being good isn't enough if we're not also being honest with ourselves about our biases." The chief watched from the back as officers began sharing their own experiences, asking questions they might have been afraid to ask before. This was the kind of honest dialogue he'd hoped for, not forced or scripted, but genuine and sometimes uncomfortable. During the break, the chief stepped into his office to find several messages waiting. The first was from the independent review board they've established. They'd begun reviewing past complaints and had already identified several officers who needed additional training or supervision. The process wasn't popular with everyone, but it was necessary. The second message was more surprising. Other police departments were reaching out, wanting to know more about their new training program. The dashcam video had gone viral, but not in the way these videos usually did. Instead of just highlighting a problem, it was showing a path toward solution. Back in the training room, the afternoon session brought in community members to share their perspectives. The chief watched as officers who'd served for decades sat and listened to young people describe their fears during traffic stops, to parents explain the detailed instructions they gave their children about police interactions. One interaction particularly caught his attention. An older woman was describing her grandson's recent traffic stop, and the officer from the chief's incident raised his hand. "Ma'am," he said, "I was that officer. I stopped your grandson, and I want to apologize." The room fell silent as the officer and the grandmother talked. There were tears, honest words, and eventually, understanding. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. Years of distrust couldn't be erased in a moment, but it was a start. Later that day, the chief met with his command staff to review the new accountability measures. Each officer's traffic stop data would now be reviewed monthly for patterns of bias. Body camera footage would be regularly audited, not just when complaints were filed. And most importantly, community feedback would be treated as valuable insight, not criticism to be defended against. "Some officers aren't happy about these changes," one captain mentioned during the meeting. "Change isn't supposed to be comfortable," the chief replied, "but it is necessary." They discussed the mentorship program they were implementing, pairing officers with community leaders for regular ride-alongs and conversations. The officer from the traffic stop had already volunteered to be among the first participants. As the day drew to a close, the chief found himself back in his office, looking at a photo on his wall. It showed him as a rookie officer, 25 years ago, full of idealism and hope. He thought about how much had changed since then, and how much still needed to change. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. It was the officer from the traffic stop, holding a folder. "Sir," he said, "I've been working with the training unit to develop that new program you suggested. Would you mind taking a look?" The chief gestured to a chair, and as they reviewed the proposal, he felt a glimmer of hope. Real change didn't happen overnight, but it did happen: one honest conversation, one changed mind, one improved policy at a time. 1 year after the traffic stop that changed everything, the chief stood at a podium in the City Hall preparing to present the annual police department report to the City Council. But this year's report was different. It wasn't just about crime statistics and budget numbers. It was about transformation. A year ago, he began, I experienced something that many in our community had been telling us about for years. It took being on the other side of the badge for me to truly understand. Today, I want to share what we've learned and how we've changed. The presentation screen behind him filled with graphs and numbers, but these weren't just cold statistics. Each one told a story of real progress. Traffic stop data showed a dramatic decrease in racial disparities. Complaint numbers had dropped, while positive community feedback had increased. But the most important changes couldn't be captured in charts and graphs. In the audience, the chief could see many familiar faces. There was the officer from that fateful traffic stop, now promoted to lead the department's new community bridge program. Next to him sat community leaders who had gone from being vocal critics of the department to active partners in its transformation. Our officers now spend 1 day each month in community engagement activities, the chief explained. Not as police officers, but as neighbors, as listeners, as learners. He played a short video showing officers helping at local food banks, attending neighborhood meetings, and participating in youth sports programs. The video shifted to interviews with officers who had gone through the new training program. I thought I knew this community, one veteran officer said on screen. But sitting down and really listening to people's experiences, it changed how I see everything about my job. Another clip showed a traffic stop from the previous week. The difference was striking. The officer's approach was respectful, professional, and human. There was no hand on the holster, no aggressive tone, just clear communication and basic dignity. This isn't about being soft on crime, the chief continued, addressing a common criticism. It's about being smart about public safety. When communities trust their police officers, they're more likely to report crimes, provide information, and work with us to keep neighborhoods safe. The numbers backed this up. Crime reporting had increased in areas where community trust had been lowest, leading to more successful investigations. Response times had improved because officers weren't tied up making unnecessary traffic stops. But the most powerful part of the presentation came when the chief invited others to speak. Community members shared stories of positive interactions with police. Officers talked about how the changes had made their jobs more satisfying and often safer. The officer from the original traffic stop stood to share his story. A year ago, I was almost fired for making a huge mistake, he said. Instead, I was given a chance to be part of the solution. Today, I train other officers and I start every session by showing them my own dashcam footage. It's not comfortable to watch, but that discomfort leads to growth. A teenage boy spoke next, describing a recent traffic stop. The officer explained exactly why I was pulled over, he said. He was respectful, clear, and actually took time to show me what I'd done wrong. It felt like he was there to help, not to punish. The chief returned to the podium for his closing remarks. Change isn't easy, he acknowledged. We've lost some officers who weren't willing to adapt. But we've gained something more valuable, the trust of our community. He clicked to the final slide, showing a recent community event where officers and residents worked together to build a playground. This is what real public safety looks like, he said. It's not us versus them, it's just us, all of us working together. After the presentation, as people mingled in the hall, the chief overheard snippets of conversation. Officers chatting easily with community members, sharing stories and plans for future projects. The barriers that had once seemed insurmountable were slowly coming down. A young officer approached him, holding a notebook. Chief, she said, I've been thinking about some ideas for expanding the community bridge program. Her enthusiasm reminded him of his own early days on the force, but with a crucial difference. She was starting her career in a department that was learning from its mistakes, not defending them. As he drove home that evening, the chief passed through the same neighborhood where he'd been pulled over a year ago. So much had changed since that night, yet there was still work to be done. Real transformation, he'd learned, wasn't a destination but a journey, one that required constant vigilance, honesty, and commitment. He thought about all the future officers who would join the force, who would watch that dashcam footage in training, who would learn from what had almost been just another bad statistic. Sometimes, he realized, the best lessons come from the hardest moments. And sometimes, what looks like an ending is really just a beginning.